The backyard was buzzing with life, laughter circling the fire pit, the smell of barbecue heavy in the air, children weaving through the crowd as if the night belonged to them. I stood near the patio, a paper plate balanced in my hand, my smile thin and practiced. It was the kind of neighborhood gathering where everyone pretended to be closer than they really were, and secrets traveled faster than the breeze. That was when I felt the soft brush of my sister's arm as she leaned close, her words meant only for me. "Don't get involved," she whispered. "It'll only hurt you." Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't have to be. The sting of those words cut deeper than anything shouted could have. For a moment I froze, pretending not to hear, pretending not to feel the ground shift under me. My smile remained fixed, but inside something splintered. And then, as if her warning weren't enough, she pivoted gracefully back toward the group. With a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth, she said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Her son doesn't even answer her calls anymore. Blocked her number, can you believe it?" The laughter was instant. Heads turned toward me, eyes glittering with cruel amusement. My humiliation was on display, unwrapped like some party trick meant for their entertainment. I stood there, cheeks burning, heart pounding so loudly I thought the whole yard might hear it. I wanted to defend him, to say he was busy, that young men sometimes needed space, that he wasn't cruel, just overwhelmed. The words rose in my throat, but they died there, strangled by pride and shame. So I simply nodded, as if her story hadn't cut me open in front of half the neighborhood. The laughter faded, but the silence that followed was worse. They moved on to new jokes, new stories, while I stood still, feeling smaller than I had in years. My son had blocked my number, yes, but now in their eyes I was more than just ignored, I was pitiful. I excused myself, slipping into the darker edge of the yard where the shadows offered cover. My sister's words echoed, wrapping tighter and tighter around me. "Don't get involved, it'll only hurt you." But here's the thing no one there knew, not my sister, not the smirking neighbors who laughed at my expense. I wasn't the type to shrink away. Shame might have pressed me down in public, but in private it hardened into resolve. Because if my son thought blocking my number was enough to erase me, he was wrong. If my neighbors thought their laughter could reduce me to silence, they underestimated me. And if my sister believed I'd simply accept humiliation and walk away, she hadn't been paying attention all these years. I wasn't going to beg for his attention. I wasn't going to chase after scraps of his time like a desperate woman. No, I was going to remind everyone that his life, his choices, even his comforts were still tethered to me. He might have blocked my calls, but I had access to something far more powerful than his phone. So as the laughter faded and the evening stretched on, I sharpened my resolve in silence. My humiliation had been public, yes, but so would my answer. I didn't just stand there and take it, I didn't just stay, I bought in, and soon enough they would all see what that meant. People often think humiliation burns only in the moment, that once the laughter fades and the crowd disperses, the wound closes. But that night, as I drove home in silence, headlights carving tunnels through the darkness, I knew better. The shame clung to me not because of what they said, but because of what it implied. That after everything I had built, after everything I had sacrificed, I was disposable, forgettable. See, I hadn't been handed a stable life. I clawed my way to it. Long before my son was old enough to decide whether or not he wanted me in his life, I had fought battles he'll never know about just to make sure he had a chance to choose. I was the one working double shifts, pouring coffee until my hands shook, and taking in laundry late into the night just to cover the rent. I was the one who learned to stretch $1 into 3 meals, who went without new shoes so he could have the cleats he begged for one summer. And I was the one who told myself, over and over, that it didn't matter how invisible the work was because that's what mothers do. Stability wasn't a gift, it was a war, and I won it for him. So when my sister whispered her warning, when she looked at me with that mixture of pity and pragmatism, it wasn't just about him blocking my number. It was about her saying, "You've wasted yourself and now look where it got you." My sister has always believed in cutting losses quickly. Pragmatic, she calls it. Cold, I'd say. She left her marriage at the first sign of trouble, moved across town without a backward glance, and treats loyalty like a luxury no one can afford. She thinks resilience is just stubbornness dressed up in Sunday clothes. But me, I've always believed differently. To me, fairness isn't negotiable. If I put in the work, if I sacrificed, if I showed up time and again, then I deserved something in return. Maybe not gratitude, not always, but at least respect. Acknowledgement. So yes, my son blocking me stung like nothing else. Because it wasn't just silence on the other end of the phone, it was dismissal. It was him saying without words that everything I had done was weightless, forgettable, irrelevant. And that mattered. The community plays into it too. In neighborhoods like mine, people measure you not just by what you own, but by what your children become. It's an unspoken scoreboard. My sister knows this. It's why she made sure her comment landed with the neighbors. Because in their eyes, if your child wants nothing to do with you, you've failed. But I don't wear failure well, I never have. So when I say I wasn't going to let this slide, it wasn't pride alone. It was principle. It was a refusal to let all those nights of sacrifice, all those years of climbing uphill, be erased by a laugh around a fire pit. My son thought he was making a statement by blocking my number. He didn't realize I could make a louder one. And maybe you're wondering, why does any of this matter so much? Why not just let it go, chalk it up to a phase, and move on? Because if I let it go, then every sacrifice I made was for nothing. If I let it go, then my sister was right, that all my stubbornness, all my grit was wasted effort. And if I let it go, then I would have to accept being invisible. And I've spent too many years fighting to be seen. By the way, since you're listening to this story right now, let me ask, where are you listening from tonight? I always wonder where these stories land. Some of you are sitting in quiet kitchens, some driving through dark roads like I once did, maybe some even listening with people you love. I ask because it matters. Stories like this are about ties, family, community, legacy. And I wonder how far those ties stretch and where they reach. So yes, it mattered, more than my sister could ever understand. To her, loyalty is weakness. To me, it's the only thing that makes survival worthwhile. And if she thought her little whisper would be enough to break me, if my neighbors thought their laughter could shame me into silence, they had no idea how wrong they were. Because humiliation might sting, but for me it's fuel. And I was just getting started. The neighborhood association liked to pretend it was the backbone of our little community. Meetings in the library basement, minutes typed up with self-importance, rules enforced with more zeal than reason. I'd attended more than my share, listening patiently as they debated the color of fence paint or the placement of trash cans. But this time was different. I walked into that basement with my head high, only to feel the shift in the room. Whispers hushed, eyes averted. Even before the meeting began, I knew something had changed. The president, a man named Robert with slicked back hair and a permanent smirk, called the session to order. His voice carried the arrogance of someone who believed authority was his birthright. "Before we get to tonight's agenda," he said, shuffling his papers with unnecessary theatrics, "we need to address a delicate matter." My stomach tightened. He looked directly at me, savoring the pause. It's come to our attention that certain members are behind on their association dues. And while normally we'd handle such issues privately, repeated lapses require transparency. For the sake of the community. Gasps rippled through the room, every eye snapped to me. I felt the blood drain from my face. Yes, I'd missed a payment, just one, a delay, nothing more. The check had been mailed late after a medical bill swallowed my budget whole. It wasn't negligence, it was life, but Robert knew exactly what he was doing. "This isn't about shame," he continued, lips curling. "It's about responsibility. If we're all expected to contribute, then no one should be given a pass." My hands clenched in my lap. I wanted to shout, to remind him of the volunteer hours I'd put in, the bake sales, the cleanup drives. But instead, I forced my voice steady. "Robert," I said, "you could have spoken to me privately." You know my record, you know I've always contributed." He gave a mock sigh, "And you know the rules. Exceptions lead to favoritism, and favoritism breeds resentment. Surely you don't want that on your conscience." The room murmured, people shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. My humiliation from the backyard replayed itself in sharper focus. Once again, I was being made into an example. After the meeting adjourned, I stayed behind. Robert was stacking papers into his briefcase, smugness radiating off him like cologne. "You didn't have to do that," I said quietly, approaching him. He didn't look up, didn't I? Accountability only works if it's visible. "Accountability," I repeated, my voice sharpening, "or spectacle, because it felt like the latter." Now he looked at me finally. His eyes narrowed, amusement laced with contempt. "Look, if you can't keep up, maybe it's time to step back. Some of us take responsibility seriously." The words landed like stones. Step back. That was what my sister wanted too. That was what the neighbors laughed for. Everyone wanted me small, silent, ashamed. "I've never stepped back from anything in my life," I said, steel edging my tone. He smirked. "Maybe it's time you learned how." The air between us tightened, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps. For a moment I imagined flipping his briefcase across the table, scattering his precious papers. But I didn't. I stood tall instead. "You think you embarrassed me tonight," I said softly. "But all you've done is shown me exactly where you stand. And where I stand, Robert, is not behind you." His smile faltered just for a second, then he snapped his briefcase shut. "Be careful," he said. "People who go against the board don't usually come out ahead." I didn't flinch. "We'll see." I walked out of that basement with my humiliation burning hotter than ever, but also with something sharper, cleaner: resolve. He thought tonight was about shaming me. What he didn't realize was that he'd just crossed a line. And I had every intention of showing him what happened when someone pushed me too far. Because I wasn't just going to survive his little display. I was going to answer it methodically, quietly. And when the time came, unmistakably on the surface, the neighborhood carried on as usual. Lawns trimmed, porches swept, the illusion of order preserved. If you didn't look too closely, everything seemed harmonious. But once you'd been humiliated in front of that harmony, you started noticing the cracks. And the cracks were everywhere. It began with whispers, passing comments at the grocery store, hushed exchanges in the parking lot after Sunday service. Snippets like, "Didn't the association fees go up again?" Or "Funny how Robert's projects always get the biggest slice of the budget." They were fragments, but they stacked up like bricks. So I listened quietly, deliberately. And the more I listened, the more I realized something didn't add up. One night, curiosity gnawed at me enough to push past my hesitation. I sat at my kitchen table, the glow of my laptop spilling across unpaid bills, and searched public records. Contracts, budgets, filings. Most people wouldn't know where to look, but I did. Years of working double jobs had taught me how to stretch a dollar, and that skill translated easily into recognizing when someone was cooking the books. And Robert was cooking them. Badly. Inflated invoices for landscaping projects. Mysterious consulting fees paid out to companies with no real addresses. The numbers were all there, hidden in plain sight. My humiliation had been a smokescreen, I realized, because if people were laughing at me, they weren't looking at him. The discovery was equal parts vindicating and infuriating. He hadn't just embarrassed me for the sake of pride. He'd done it to cover his own corruption. But I knew better than to confront him with just my word against his. I needed proof. I needed someone else to see what I was seeing. That ally came from the most unlikely corner. Mrs. Green lived 3 doors down, a quiet widow who rarely spoke at meetings. Most saw her as fragile, harmless. But when I knocked on her door one afternoon, folder of documents tucked under my arm, her eyes sharpened the moment I explained what I'd found. "I knew it," she whispered almost to herself. Then louder, "I knew that man was stealing." I blinked, taken aback. "You suspected?" Her lips pressed thin. My late husband kept the books for a living, numbers don't lie. I've been watching Robert funnel funds for years, but no one wanted to hear it from me. She tapped the stack of invoices I handed her, her fingers steady despite her age. But with these records, people will have to listen. In that moment, the balance shifted. What had been just my humiliation and my anger transformed into something larger, something undeniable. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't bitter, I was right. The next neighborhood meeting was still weeks away, but I no longer dreaded it. Instead, I sharpened my focus, gathering more, documenting carefully. Every receipt, every discrepancy, every whisper of doubt from a neighbor, it all went into my growing arsenal. The surface harmony of our neighborhood was nothing more than a painted fence, rotting underneath. And I had the tools to prove it. Robert thought he'd silenced me. He thought shame would keep me in check. But what he didn't realize was that his own arrogance had handed me exactly what I needed: motive, proof, and now an ally. The facade was cracking, and soon it wouldn't just be me who saw it, it would be everyone. The thing about corruption is that it survives on silence. As long as no one speaks, it thrives. As long as people convince themselves it's not their business, it grows roots so deep it feels impossible to tear out. That was the spell Robert had woven over our neighborhood: distraction, intimidation, humiliation. Keep them quiet and he stayed safe. But silence was never my strong suit. After nights of combing through documents, highlighting discrepancies, and cross-checking contracts with Mrs. Green, I had enough to take the first step. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it was clean, lawful, and undeniable. I filed a formal complaint with the county auditor's office. The clerk barely looked up as she stamped my paperwork, slid it into a stack, and moved on. To her, it was routine. To me, it was the sound of the first stone turning. For the first time in months, I felt steady. The ripple effect started small. A week later, I overheard two neighbors whispering outside the corner store. "Did you hear? Someone filed against the association." "Really? Against Roberts?" "That's what I heard. Guess not everyone thinks he's untouchable." The murmurs grew. No one knew it was me, not yet, but suspicion had already started to erode the illusion of Robert's authority. And that was the point. Still, a complaint alone wasn't enough. Bureaucracy moves slowly, and Robert was clever enough to spin delay into dismissal. So I made a second move, one he couldn't ignore. There was a small property on the edge of the neighborhood, a neglected duplex Robert had been circling for months, waiting to scoop it up cheap through one of his shell companies. It wasn't much to look at, but it was valuable. It sat on land that gave whoever owned it leverage in future development talks. So I bought it quietly, legally. With savings I had hoarded for years, money scraped together from shifts and side jobs, money I'd meant to keep for emergencies. Well, this was an emergency. When the papers were signed, I stood in that cracked driveway, looking at the peeling paint and overgrown grass, and felt something I hadn't in months: control. Robert found out within days. He cornered me outside the post office, his voice low but sharp. "You think you're clever," he hissed, "buying up what doesn't belong to you." "It belongs to whoever signs the deed," I said calmly. "And last I checked, that's me." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're playing with." "Oh, I do," I replied, "and I'm just getting started." He stormed off, but the exchange didn't go unnoticed. Two women by the newspaper rack whispered behind their hands. A man on the sidewalk raised his brows. And just like that, the rumors gained weight. By the time the next association meeting rolled around, the air buzzed with tension. People were polite but distant. Neighbors who once laughed at my expense now looked at me differently, not with pity but with caution. Because whether they admitted it or not, they could feel the balance shifting. Robert opened the meeting with his usual pomp, but there was a stiffness in his voice, a strain under the surface. He knew the complaint was out there. He knew I had the property he wanted. And though he tried to mask it, cracks showed in his performance. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to remind them of my humiliation. My actions had already spoken. One complaint, one property, small acts maybe, but the ripples were undeniable. Whispers spread faster than wildfire in a neighborhood like ours. And though no one said it aloud, everyone was starting to wonder the same thing. If I had turned over one stone, how many more was I prepared to lift? Robert wanted me invisible. Instead, I was becoming unavoidable. And that was only the beginning. If turning the first stone felt bold, what came next demanded endurance. Robert thought he could wait me out, that I'd lose steam, that exhaustion would do what humiliation couldn't. And truthfully, there were nights when he almost won. I'd sit at my kitchen table, documents spread across the wood like a battlefield. Receipts, bylaws, property records, all of it demanding my attention long after the neighborhood had gone to bed. My eyes burned from late-night reading, my fingers cramped from notes, my chest tight from the constant hum of stress. Every bill I paid late, every meal I skipped to stretch savings reminded me of the personal cost. But then I'd remember the laughter by the fire pit, the smirk on Robert's face in the basement, my son's silence, and I would push forward. Step by step, I built momentum. The second property came first, a modest corner lot no one thought much of. Then a third, a rundown unit Robert had intended for one of his projects. Each acquisition was legal, clean, and strategic. None were grand victories alone, but together they formed a pattern. I was building something larger than myself, something Robert couldn't easily dismiss. Meanwhile, the complaint I'd filed began to stir in the county office. Auditors requested additional documents. Questions trickled back toward the association. Robert tried to wave it off as routine oversight, but the murmurs in the neighborhood grew louder. People weren't laughing at me anymore, they were watching him closely. It wasn't just about the properties or the paperwork. It was about credibility. The more meticulous I was, the harder it became for Robert to frame me as reckless. My quiet stubbornness was turning into proof of integrity, and whether they said it aloud or not, my neighbors were noticing. Of course, Robert fought back. He tried to paint me as unstable, obsessed, bitter. At one meeting, he even suggested that I was harassing the board with frivolous requests. His words were sharp, designed to cut. But then something happened I hadn't expected. A voice from the back of the room, a young man I barely knew, spoke up. "I don't think her questions are frivolous," he said evenly. "If anything, I think we should all be asking the same ones." The room fell silent. Robert's glare faltered. That moment was a crack of lightning across the storm, because once one person dared to support me publicly, others followed. Mrs. Green raised her hand, steady as ever. "She's right to question. I've suspected financial irregularities for years." A murmur of agreement spread, hesitant but real. Robert tried to regain control, banging his gavel a little too hard, but the momentum had shifted. The meeting ended not with his smirk, but with a ripple of side conversations that weren't in his favor. I walked home that night exhausted, shoulders aching from the weight of weeks of pressure, but for the first time I wasn't walking alone in spirit. Someone had spoken up for me. Someone had validated what I knew in my bones, that I wasn't fighting shadows, I was fighting rot. The cost was mounting, no doubt. My bank account was thinner, my nights longer, my patience stretched taut. But in exchange, I was gaining something Robert couldn't buy: trust, credibility, momentum. And momentum, once it builds, is nearly impossible to stop. He had wanted me quiet. Instead, I was becoming a voice. And soon, that voice wouldn't be mine alone. It would be an echo carried by a community ready to see the truth. Robert's facade was cracking wider every day. And while the pressure was crushing me in private, in public it was reshaping the battlefield. This was no longer just about humiliation. This was about justice, and I was willing to pay the price. The day of the confrontation arrived like a storm breaking. I entered the neighborhood association's conference room with my folder of evidence, a calmness in my step that belied the months of late nights and quiet plotting. Robert sat at the head of the table, smug as ever, surrounded by the board he thought untouchable. "Ah," he said, leaning back, fingers steepled, "I see you've decided to grace us with your presence." His tone dripped with condescension. "I'm here to present facts, Robert," I replied evenly, placing my folder on the table. "Not insults, not theatrics, facts." He smirked. "And what makes you think anyone cares about your facts?" The first page contained contracts, invoices, and public records I had meticulously organized. I flipped it open, pushing it forward. "This," I said calmly, "shows inflated project fees paid to shell companies. This shows misappropriation of association funds. And this," I added, tapping a highlighted section, "shows deliberate exclusion of members from key financial decisions." A murmur ran through the room. Board members shifted uneasy. Robert waved a hand dismissively. "You'll see the auditors will find nothing. Your obsession is." "Obsession?" I interrupted, my voice steady. "Or diligence?" I leaned forward slightly, letting my gaze meet his. "Every number here is traceable, verifiable. Your excuses don't change that." He blinked, momentarily thrown. "You think you're clever, filing complaints, buying property." "I'm not clever," I said, my tone flat but firm. "I'm thorough, I'm responsible. Unlike someone who hides behind theatrics to cover mismanagement." The room fell silent. I let the weight of my words settle. Every accusation, every document, every methodical step I had taken over the past months hung in the air like a scale. "People are watching now," I continued. "Not because I asked them to, but because the truth is evident. They notice who acts for the community and who acts for themselves. You wanted me humiliated, you wanted me silent, but that's not how accountability works." Robert's jaw tightened, lips pressed in a hard line. He sputtered, searching for some counter, some insult, some way to regain control, but the words caught in his throat. No theatrics could undo the facts. No smirk could rewrite the numbers. I closed the folder slowly. "I came here to make one thing clear. Leadership is not a shield for misconduct. It is a responsibility, and if you can't meet that responsibility, it's time someone else does." A long silence followed. Board members exchanged glances. Robert's facade of confidence had cracked under the weight of meticulous evidence and unwavering composure. Finally, he leaned back, face pale, voice low. You've done your homework." I nodded once, "And I will continue to do so for the community, not for revenge, not for spectacle, for accountability." His smirk was gone. The arrogance, replaced by the subtle tremor of someone who realizes control has shifted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Quiet strength had outweighed bluster. Methodical action had eclipsed theatrics. And the room, once a theater of humiliation, now bore witness to a new reality. One where truth, patience, and diligence carried far more weight than arrogance and intimidation. Robert sat frozen, and I walked out of that room with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. The confrontation was over. The power dynamic had shifted. The storm had broken, and I had weathered it. In the days following the confrontation, the neighborhood seemed quieter. Not peaceful, quiet, tense, as if everyone were waiting for the next tremor. But the tremor had already struck, and its shockwaves were impossible to ignore. The association's leadership, once confident and untouchable, began to crumble under scrutiny. Auditors followed the paper trail I had meticulously compiled. Contracts were revisited, budgets dissected, and questionable payouts flagged. Robert's veneer of authority faltered with every call from the county office, every neighbor questioning his decisions behind closed doors. Whispers that once focused on me now shifted to him. "Did you see what they found in the books?" I can't believe he'd risk it all for a corner property. Finally, someone is holding him accountable. Neighbors recalibrated loyalties quietly but decisively. Those who had once chuckled at my expense now approached with cautious respect. Some apologized for their laughter, claiming ignorance. Others offered information, documents, and support, proof of the very mismanagement I had uncovered. Even Robert's closest allies began to distance themselves. No one wanted to be caught defending someone now under formal investigation. The board, once a symbol of his dominion, splintered as questions mounted. Meetings were postponed, decisions stalled, and the illusion of unity collapsed. It was law, procedure, and evidence that carried the weight. Not gossip, not revenge. Every move I had made had been clean, lawful, and deliberate. There was no room for retaliation. The rules were on my side, the community witnesses, and the facts undeniable. And then came the unexpected. Victor, a neighbor who had long rivaled me for influence in community matters, approached me on a quiet street corner. He was the kind of man who thrived on power games and posturing. I'd always assumed he would see my efforts as a threat, an annoyance, or both. "You played it smart," he said, his voice low, almost grudging. "I didn't expect you to actually follow through." I studied him carefully, noting the rare absence of condescension. "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded, uneasy. "Not sure I like it, but you've got their attention, and Robert isn't invincible anymore. Not for long." It was respect of a sort. Uneasy, yes, but respect nonetheless. A pattern interrupt in a neighborhood used to rigid roles, petty rivalries, and predictable allegiances. The dynamic had shifted. The community began to function differently. Meetings were more transparent, conversations more cautious, decisions more accountable. People stopped assuming that authority equaled untouchable power. And in those small, quiet shifts, I saw the ripple of justice extend further than any complaint, purchase, or confrontation could achieve alone. I didn't celebrate, there was no need. The work had been meticulous, patient, and methodical. I had expected no fanfare, no applause. The satisfaction was quiet, steady, and unshakable. Truth had prevailed, fairness had been restored, and corruption no longer hid in the shadows. Robert still lingered in the background, trying to regain composure, but the control he once wielded had eroded beyond repair. Public opinion had shifted, and every attempt to reassert authority was met with skepticism, eyes sharp, questioning, unyielding. The dust had settled and the landscape had changed. What had once been humiliation, then rage, then careful escalation was now justice enacted. No theatrics, no shortcuts, only patience, diligence, and the law. And in that calm aftermath, I finally felt the weight of months lift. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was honest. That more than anything mattered, the neighborhood had shifted. What once had been chaos, rivalry, and humiliation now carried a new rhythm, one of accountability, cautious trust, and subtle hope. But my work wasn't over. Revenge had satisfied a momentary need, yes, but it was purpose that would endure. I began investing in the community, not to show power, but to build stability. I started small, funding after-school programs for children whose parents were too busy to watch over homework, organizing volunteer days to clean neglected parks, and providing modest support for families struggling to keep up with housing costs. It wasn't flashy, no one wrote headlines, but each effort made a tangible difference. The vacant corner duplex I had purchased, it became a small hub for tutoring and neighborhood meetings. Families who had once felt invisible now had a safe, reliable space. I reflected on what had driven me through the humiliation, the long nights of research, and the confrontations. It hadn't been pride or vengeance alone. It had been a sense of fairness, of dignity, and of boundaries firmly maintained. I learned that true power doesn't come from dominance or fear. It comes from action rooted in principle and sustained over time. Revenge had been a tool, yes, but a temporary one. Purpose was lasting. That realization reshaped everything. I no longer measured my success by Robert's discomfort or the murmurs of neighbors impressed by my tactics. I measured it by the impact I could create, the stability I could foster, the legacy I could leave behind. I thought often about my son. Blocking his number had stung, yes, but the choices I made now were for him too, for his future, for the model of integrity and patience I wanted him to see. Boundaries weren't just about punishment. They were about teaching respect and demonstrating that consequences exist even quietly for those who ignore them. By stabilizing housing, mentoring youth, and ensuring transparency in local affairs, I had transformed humiliation into something constructive. My reputation had shifted from a target of ridicule to a respected, albeit quietly powerful presence. And every evening, as I walked past the community spaces I had helped nurture, I felt a sense of peace that vengeance alone could never provide. Revenge had answered the immediate wrongs. Purpose ensured that the wrongs could not recur. And dignity, carefully maintained, became the thread that tied it all together. I had learned the value of measured action, patience, and investment in what lasts longer than ego. As the sun set over the neighborhood streets, I knew that the legacy I wanted to leave wasn't one of grudges or spectacle, but one of fairness, strength, and quiet justice that would outlive any fleeting humiliation. And in that knowledge, I finally found calm. I didn't call my sister that night, nor did she call me. Months of tension, whispers, and silent observation had passed. And in the quiet that followed, I realized that not all conversations need words to find closure. When we finally met at the grocery store, it was a simple encounter. No dramatics, no lingering accusations, just a nod, brief eye contact, and the faintest hint of acknowledgement. Respectful silence replaced what used to be judgment. "You were right about one thing," she said softly, almost in passing. "It wasn't going to be easy." "I know," I replied evenly, "but it had to be done." We didn't discuss the neighborhood, Robert, or the properties. That wasn't necessary. The story had been written in actions, in patience, and in the community itself. Our reconciliation, if it could be called that, existed in quiet understanding, an acknowledgement that while we see the world differently, there is room for mutual respect. Walking away, I felt a sense of completion. The gate had closed, not with finality, not with triumph, but with clarity. I had honored my principles, protected my dignity, and turned humiliation into purpose. And now, as I reflect on everything that's happened, I want to ask you, yes, you listening right now, what would you do? Would you forgive and rebuild, or would you hold your distance, letting boundaries remain firm? There's no right answer. I'd like to hear why. Because life isn't about easy choices. It's about navigating consequences, respecting limits, and knowing when to act, not out of anger, but out of principle. The neighborhood is quieter now, but stories never truly end. Every block, every street corner, every family has its own hidden battles, waiting for someone to notice, to intervene, to act. And when the next story comes, when the next line is crossed, I'll be ready. For now, the gate is closed, but the world, as always, remains open.